The goal. Oh, thanks, Parker. So, as a note, we will be recording this session just for your information. And the goal of today's meeting is to provide a general overview of the study and share some of our initial findings. After a brief presentation, we'll provide an opportunity for you to share your feedback and ask any questions that you might have. So we have developed this agenda that's shown on the screen, and I'll lead us through introductions to start out. Representing the Montana Department of Transportation is Jacqueline Smith, pre-construction engineer for the Missoula District. And we'll be hearing from Jacqueline about why MDT elected to pursue a study of the Ninepipe corridor. Also from MDT, we have Parker Osterloh, Vicki Cernich, and Katie Potts, all of whom work for the Rail Transit and Planning Division. And Parker has been serving as MDT's project manager, but that role is transitioning to Vicki, and Katie is providing oversight from the Planning Division. Vicki will be talking with us about what is involved in the feasibility study process. My name is Sarah Nicolai, and I'm a transportation engineer with Robert Petch and Associates, and I'll be helping facilitate the meeting today. And with me is Scott Randall from RPA. He is managing the study on our side, and he'll present some of the findings from our initial investigations in the corridor. So for today's meeting, we'll start off with a brief history of the study area, and then we'll provide some background on the purpose of the study and the steps that are involved. And then we'll go over the analysis of relevant conditions that was completed in late 2021 last year, and we'll share some of our findings. We'll also talk with you about next steps in the study process and explain how you can stay involved. We'll save some time at the end for an open discussion period where you'll be able to type in your questions and comments. So before we get started with the presentation, I did want to touch on a few housekeeping items. As I mentioned, we'll be addressing all of your questions and comments at the end of our presentation. In the meantime, though, please do feel free to type your questions and comments into the chat box on your screen. And you should see an icon similar to the one that's shown right here with our cursor. So if you click on that icon, the chat box will pop up and you can type in your question. After the presentation, we'll read through each of those questions and comments, and our team will be ready to provide responses. If for some reason you're unable to type or you would like to ask your question later on or privately, I will provide contact information for you to submit your comment and question after the meeting. And there's also an opportunity for you to do that on MDT's website. So with that, I will turn it over to Jacqueline to talk about why MDT is pursuing this study and provide some background on past efforts in the corridor.
Thank you, Sarah. Improvements to the Ninepipe segment of the US 93 corridor have been discussed for some time now, with planning efforts dating back to 1996, and an environmental impact statement, or EIS, and a record of decision were completed for US 93 between Evero and Polson. For the area between Post Creek Hill and Ronan, which includes the Ninepipe corridor, the record of decision, or what's known as the decision document, deferred the determination of specific design details. So in 2008, a supplemental environmental impact statement, or SEIS, was completed to identify the design details. We will be referring to this 2008 SEIS in this presentation today. Since completion of these previous efforts, MDT has continued to develop projects for segments of US 93 adjacent to the Ninepipe segment, including Post Creek Hill and Ronan Urban, which has been split into two projects, Ronan North and Ronan Urban. Excuse me. Design for the Ronan North project is complete, and a virtual public meeting was recently held in November 21. MDT is currently working on right-of-way acquisition, permitting, and utility and maintenance agreements. Construction for the Ronan North project is planned to start in late 2022 or early 23, with the exact timing dependent on the completion of the tasks I just mentioned. Design is ongoing for the Post Creek Hill segment and the Ronan Urban segment, and MDT will continue to provide public outreach for both of these projects as they continue to progress. When developing these projects, MDT has encountered a number of unexpected challenges related to constructability, impacts, and costs. I'm sure for those of you familiar with this area, this statement does not come as a surprise. This is an extremely complex area. One example includes the groundwater challenges that are making it difficult to design the previous projects and proactively, or sorry about that. The water challenges are making it incredibly challenging to design the bridge for Post Creek. And we want to learn from our lessons that we're working through on these current design projects and apply them towards this planned Ninepipe segment and nominate a project based on educated information from area projects. Thank you, Scott. During the previous environmental studies, a range of corridor alternatives were considered with various lane configurations. For the Ninepipe corridor, the SEIS identified a preferred alternative that consists of a 2-lane roadway with 1 lane in each direction, widened shoulders, wildlife crossing structures, and a separated shared use path. The preferred alternative was identified based on its ability to best meet the purpose and need for the project to improve highway safety and operations, minimize costs, and minimize impacts to sensitive resources, including wetlands and wildlife. This is the starting point that we're using for this feasibility study. Our focus is to determine if the preferred alternative is feasible to construct and still make sense for this corridor. I'm going to turn it over to Vicki now, who will talk in more detail about the feasibility study process.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So for this feasibility study, we'll be focusing primarily on whether the preferred alternative, the one that was identified in the 2008 SEIS, still makes sense given updated information and the lessons learned. So with this process, we're verifying the baseline conditions and identifying what has changed and what new information has been available since 2008. So we're looking only at the relevant conditions, meaning that we're focusing on those elements we think could affect development of the preferred alternative in a substantial way as it relates to impacts, costs, and construction. We're relying on both existing information and additional data, which included some updated field investigations. So this information is going to help us determine if the preferred alternative defined in the 2008 SEIS is feasible to implement, or if minor modifications could be incorporated to minimize impacts and costs. Ultimately, the outcome of the study will assist MDT in project development decisions and will support future environmental documentation for the Ninepipe segment, which will be needed to comply with state and federal regulations. Next up, Scott's going to talk about the findings of the relevant conditions analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. So as you mentioned, so we've been working to investigate relevant conditions in the study area and identify what's changed since the 2008 environmental study was complete, which is now 14 years old. So this evaluation included an analysis of current traffic and safety conditions on the corridor, the primary factor for why improvements are needed. Traffic volumes have continued to grow on the corridor and ranged from about 7,000 to 8,500 vehicles per day in 2020. So we found that the corridor currently operates at what we call level of service D. And this term, level of service, refers to the quality of motor vehicle traffic operations on a roadway, and is similar to a grade that you would receive in school, with levels ranging from an A, which represents the best conditions, to an F, which represents failing conditions. So this level of service D generally means that the roadway users are more likely to closely follow other vehicles when they're driving and would have limited passing opportunities. So the target for facilities of this type, similar to this corridor, is actually level service B, although there are some exceptions specific to this corridor that have been made in an effort to balance improving traffic operations with the potential negative impacts that come with expanding the highway. For future conditions, we evaluated different growth scenarios and found that the corridor is projected to either remain functioning similar to as it does today, to level service D, or deteriorating to a level service E if higher growth occurs. Another important note is the lack of adequate accommodations for non-motorized users. There are currently no dedicated pedestrian or bicycle facilities, and the high travel speeds and high traffic volumes on the corridor generally make it not desirable for non-motorized travel. We also looked at an updated crash data from the past 5 years, and what we found is that there were 84 total crashes that occurred during this 5-year period, or about 17 per year. Of those crashes, 28, or about a third, involved wild animals. There were also 13 rear-end crashes. Of these 84 total crashes, 5 are what we call severe, which resulted in either fatality or serious injury. And in total, there were 3 fatalities and 4 serious injuries during this 5-year period. Next, I want to discuss the land use surrounding the corridor, since we know this is such an important and sensitive area. Most of the corridor is surrounded by public lands and are managed for wildlife conservation, these areas that are shown in green on the figure. Additionally, private lands are shown in light gray on the figure. For highway improvements, the 2008 environmental study specified a minimum desirable right-of-way width of 160 feet in order to accommodate a 2-lane roadway, widened shoulders, and a separated bicycle pedestrian path. MDT generally owns the minimum width, right-of-way width throughout the corridor, although some areas are narrower, which are indicated on the map. These include just south of Eagle Pass Trail, adjacent to the Ninepipe Lodge, just north of Eagle Pass Trail, and just to the south of Brook Lane. For this study, we also completed an updated evaluation of floodplains within the study area and found that the highway passes through floodplains associated with the Ninepipe Reservoir and Crow Creek. These areas are shown in light blue on the figure. We also completed an updated inventory of wetlands and soils in the study area. And overall, there were only minor changes to information provided in 2008. Although the study did identify that there are very soft soils in the area, there's no evidence of what we call artesian conditions, which means pressurized water underneath the surface, which has been found in other nearby areas, which Jacqueline mentioned earlier. So for this corridor, this is generally good news in terms of construction feasibility, but there are certainly still challenges that remain. Additionally, the study included an evaluation of wildlife, which we know is an issue that is very important to the tribes and to the public. The Ninepipe area supports a large variety of species due to the diversity of habitats. And in coordination with resource agencies, the study evaluated wildlife presence in the corridor, habitat connectivity, and instances of injury or mortality related to vehicle conflicts. We also studied wildlife use of crossing structures similar to the ones proposed for this corridor that were recommended at the Ninepipe Reservoir, the 2 kettle ponds adjacent to the corridor, and Crow Creek, these areas that are shown in dark blue on the map. So right now we're evaluating if these crossings still make sense and will accommodate the species of greatest concern in the corridor. These include grizzly bears, other large animals such as deer and elk, birds, turtles, and other wildlife. So we're continuing to coordinate with the tribes and other state and federal resource agencies to discuss how corridor improvements could affect wildlife. And lastly, our team evaluated culturally significant features and sites within the corridor to understand how these may be affected by future improvements to the corridor. The 2008 environmental study identified 3 cultural resources, including the Flathead Indian Irrigation Project, a historical stagecoach route, and the Ninepipe cultural property. The Flathead Indian Irrigation Project is a large system with over 1,300 miles of canals, and the Highway 93 crosses or parallels some of these canals. The historic stagecoach route roughly follows the Highway 93 corridor through the Mission Valley. The route is visible as a dirt road following the southwest edge of the Ninepipe Reservoir before crossing the highway and continuing to the northeast. The Ninepipe cultural site includes area surrounding the entire Ninepipe segment and is documented as a traditional cultural property due to its unique qualities as an environmentally rich area of kettle lakes and glacial wetlands and geological history. CSKT greatly value the Ninepipe area, and this property reflects its cultural significance to the tribes. So MDT is in the process of conducting government-to-government consultation with the tribes regarding cultural resources. So we're planning to conduct field tours when the weather warms up in the springtime and to meet with CSKT Preservation Office and cultural committees to discuss these cultural resources within the corridor. So this is an ongoing effort that we continue to work on. So that brings us to the end of our overview of relevant conditions. So with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Sarah.
Scott. So I'm going to speak next about our next steps in the process. And The next steps in the process, so we will be completing a feasibility evaluation using information gathered during the relevant conditions analysis phase that Scott was just talking about. And we will analyze the alignment that was identified for the 2008 preferred alternative and define approximate construction limits in order to determine anticipated project impacts and costs. We'll also look at an alignment for the separated bicycle and pedestrian path, or what's known as a shared use path, since the SEIS gave limited information about its location. We'll be looking at which side of the roadway makes the most sense to accommodate pedestrians and bicyclists, while also minimizing impacts to important resources. And as Vicki mentioned earlier, we'll also be considering other minor modifications if we can find ways to minimize impacts and costs. As we advance through the study process, we encourage you to stay involved. The next public outreach will occur sometime in the late spring or early summer of this year, and we'll be hosting another virtual meeting focused on the results of our feasibility evaluation. And we hope you can join us again at that time. So we will now turn to your questions and comments, and we'll just ask you to type in your questions and comments in the chat box on your screen, and I'll be reading each one of these questions and our team will be ready to respond. So it looks like we have a couple of questions here queued up already in our chat box, and I'll start out first with a question from Elizabeth. Would the preferred alternative include any dedicated left turn lanes? That's a great question, Elizabeth, and I'm going to ask Scott to speak to that one.
Yeah, thanks for listening in and for the question. So right now, the preferred alternative does not include dedicated left turn lanes. There is a current safety improvement project at Eagle Pass Trail at that intersection that is adding left turn lanes at that location. And so we would perpetuate those and obviously include those with that safety improvement project, but other locations have not been identified for the addition of left turn lanes at this time.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Elizabeth, for that question. So next up, we have a question from Rich. What did the SEIS identify as the purpose and need, and won't that constrain the best alternative? So I'm not going to read the entire statement of purpose and need. It's several pages long, but I'll just touch on a couple of points, and then we'll also ask Parker to jump in on this question as well. So in terms of the purpose of the proposed action, the SEIS talked about improving level of service, mobility, traffic flow, system linkage, and safety on the transportation system. So really focusing on the functioning from a transportation perspective. In terms of the statement of need, it talked about, again, operations being poor on the corridor, talking about accidents, the number of accidents per mile and the severity. As Scott had mentioned, those were some of the areas that the SEIS also touched on, and then really limited bicycle and pedestrian facilities. So from those perspectives, feeling like there's a need to focus on safety and mobility in the project corridor. And then there's a section of the SEIS that talks about project objectives. And so I'll just touch on a couple of these as well. Improving safety, improving capacity, facilities for bicyclists and pedestrians. So we've touched on those three. Also reducing vehicle and animal conflicts was an important objective. Improving wetland and riparian connectivity, respecting the cultural significance of the land and animals in terms of the tribe's perspective. And then this last one, I think, really sums it all up for all of these different considerations, providing a balance between cost efficiency, roadway safety, traffic operations, and environmental protection. So the question from Rich is a really good one. How does the purpose and need statement and the objectives, how does that constrain the best alternative? You're exactly right, Rich, that it's really a balancing act, and MDT is trying to improve safety and operations, but also respect the cultural significance and try to minimize impacts to natural resources as best as possible. And the SEIS found that the preferred alternative was the best able to do all of those things. So Parker, wanted to turn it over to you and see if there's anything else you'd like to add as well.
Well, you did a great job. Didn't leave me much to add on. You are definitely correct though, Rich. The purpose and need does constrain what we're looking at, and that preferred alternative, rule alternative 3, is what we are examining in this study to determine if it is feasible with what we've observed on the infield on-site conditions.
Thank you, Parker, and thanks, Rich, for that that question. It looks like Rich has a follow-up question. Is there a list we can get on to be informed of the next step? And absolutely, Rich. So we will be taking all of the folks who have registered for today's virtual public meetings. We'll be adding you to our contact list, and we'll be sending email updates as we move forward with the study. So unless you opt out and tell us you don't want to hear from us anymore, we will include you on those communications. So next up, it looks like we have another comment from Elizabeth saying, thank you, that answer is helpful as Eagle Pass Trail is the greatest area of concern in terms of safe left turns. So I'm glad that we were able to address your question and comment, Elizabeth. It sounds like Scott was able to address that fully. And I'm not seeing any other questions pop up, but we'll pause just for another couple minutes to see if anyone else has a question or a comment that you'd like to share with the group.
Well, while we're waiting too, I might just ask maybe Jacqueline if you have any, do you have any additional information on the Eagle Pass Trail projects as far as time frame for it that you could share, since it seems to be of interest here?
Yeah, we're continuing to work on the design. We're still a couple years out before we're expecting to construct it. There's a possibility that we will need some right of way, and so that'll be that could drive the schedule. But we're trying to keep impacts as minimal as possible, since it is just like the corridor, it's a tight area and we don't want to have significant impacts.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And it looks like we have another entry here from Rich. So understanding that it's been separated off into a different project, are you able to provide any updates on the long-suffering Post Creek Wildlife Crossing Bridge project just south of this area? And Jacqueline, we might ask you to step in on that one as well.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. I definitely appreciate your definition of the project, the long suffering. It is an old project and it has been around, yes, a while. Just like I mentioned earlier, incredibly complex corridor and area. And so we've had a lot of design input into what we're going to do with the bridge there. And I think we've settled on going with a 500-foot structure, but we still need to work out the design details for that. So I guess we've made one step closer towards development of that project and getting it completed, but we still have a lot of details to keep working out.
Thanks, Jacqueline, and thanks, Rich, for that question. We'll pause just a couple more minutes to see if anyone else has a question or comment that you'd like to share. And maybe while we're waiting, I'll just mention on this final slide here, we did want to provide contact information for our two main points of contact. So Scott Randall, again with RPA, and then Vicki Cernich with the Montana Department of Transportation, our project manager. And if you either think of a question later or just would like to reach out to them separately from today's meeting, we do encourage you to send your comments and questions by email. You're also welcome to call Vicki and Scott by phone. And we do encourage everyone to take a look at the study website. We have posted the relevant conditions report. So it's a much more detailed version of what Scott provided in this presentation. And it looks like Parker has provided this same link to our website in the chat. So you can click on it and bring it up directly. But if you're interested in more detail about our findings, that report is a really good place to start. We also have a set of accompanying informational sheets if you're interested in reading or looking at things in a more graphical way. So do encourage you to take a look at the website. And we'll have one final call for questions or comments that you'd like to share or ask of our group. Looks like another one from Elizabeth. Is the Eagle Pass project posted anywhere that I can read about the details and timelines for that? Jacqueline, can you share with us on that?
No, I don't believe we have a website for that project, but I would like to, Elizabeth, we'll get your information and we can send you an email and start the communication, and you can ask some more direct questions if you'd like to, and we can get you the project info.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So Elizabeth, sounds like we'll be in touch with you separately on that. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, I'm seeing none. Just want to thank you all for your time today. We really appreciate it. We will be in touch with you again. I think we'll be sending a note right after these meetings, so expect to see something from us later this week, and then again later this year before our next informational meeting. So thank you again.